My name is Erik Wilde, or Erik Wilde, whatever you like better. I am also part of the API Academy together with Ronnie, and I'll be talking about service landscaping with a purpose. So to connect that to the things we've heard so far, what I found really interesting was that it seemed to me some of the questions also from the audience were a little bit indicative of that point that maybe in the microservices hype cycle, we're now entering this, what's called the Trough of Disillusionment, right? Where people start saying, yeah, I get what this thing was promising, but now that I'm trying it, maybe it's not that perfect, right? Maybe it's not the silver bullet that everybody was hoping for. And I think it's very natural with all of these things that they're not, mostly they're not as great as you might initially think. And when you start trying them, you see that there are some things you need to figure out. And to me, there was always something that I thought was kind of missing in the microservices narrative. Not just the value proposition of you make innovation cheaper, right? That great slide, I think, really that Ronnie had with like these two boxes, right? You have the innovation, the idea generation, and the idea execution, right? And on the right-hand side, you say, I'll make idea execution cheaper, so that's good. Microservices allow you to do that. And then I can have more ideas, right? I can execute faster on ideas, so hopefully I will generate more ideas and hopefully also generate more successful and good ideas. Right? So that part of the story I think everybody understands, and that part of the story is something that makes microservices very attractive. Now where I think some of the missing parts are in that overall picture of microservices is that they don't necessarily tell you how those great ideas that you have successfully executed then can be used together. Right? And we had this comment or this question about people encountering problems with how do I orchestrate microservices? Right now that I have more microservices showing up in my landscape, how can I use them together? They might be very different designs. It might be hard for me to even find them. Right? So how do I come up with an idea of how those microservices become a little bit more coherent? And there we will also, after my talk, we will hear a little bit more from Ronnie and Arnaud in their conversation about style guides, right? Teaching people a little bit of an idea of how maybe they should or they could design microservices so that you have a little bit more coherence in your landscape. And the other thing that I want to talk about a little bit is what I call landscaping, or sometimes I also refer to those things as ecosystems. This general idea that if you have this rather dynamic and diverse landscape of microservices, you probably also need to put in some effort to manage it, right? To make those things discoverable, to allow people to look at those designs, understand them. And I already talked a little bit about that yesterday in my keynote about the visibility that to some extent, the microservices don't really give you, right? They are just services. But on the other hand, you might want to have some of that so that when people start developing new services in your landscape, you actually get to the point where they have a better understanding what's going on. And for you, maybe in a role of managing an IT landscape, you have a better ability to understand what's going on, what are the things that are happening, and how can you maybe manage that a little bit better. So I'll skip through some things a little faster than I was planning on because we're a little short on time. As usual, my presentation, it's online. You can find it. I'll tweet the link when I'm done. And let's get started with some of the things I want to talk about. So let's skip through all the intro. And so the things I want to talk about is something that I've been trying to develop, and then I'll keep working on it. It's basically sort of a mental image you can have about what microservices actually are and maybe how you can think about to conceptualize them and then maybe to build up this landscape of microservices that allow you to better understand what's going on. And in conjunction with that, to me, there's also this a little bit missing story in the general microservices landscape about how do you find microservices, how do you manage those descriptions, how do you do that in a way that is in line with microservices architecture that tells you to be decentralized, to do everything on a per microservice basis, and to give teams a lot of freedom in terms of actually picking the tools that they think are good tools to solve their problems. Okay, now let's get started, and that's always my favorite part, I think one way of how you can look at microservices, and that's a way that I have named the Kafka Method, and it's named after Franz Kafka. Who knows Franz Kafka here? Okay, that's good. That's good. Usually, when you do that in Germany, right, everybody knows Franz Kafka because you have to read him in school, but still, he's a very famous writer. So, the reason why I'm using his name for this method is that he's, among other things, he's very well known for writing those books. One is called The Castle, that talk about how people interact with that system of sort of very isolated processes, right? And the way he talks about it is he frames it as bureaucracy. And that's not a very positive way of looking at it, but I tend to think it's a great mental image of how you can actually look at microservices and the idea of isolating logic from each other and also from somebody using it. And usually, I think when people try to develop those landscapes of isolated services, right, there is this temptation to actually do more than you could, that you have to do. And what bureaucracy tells us, and I really want you to think about bureaucracy as a good thing, right, which is maybe hard for you, but actually, I think it's interesting because when you look at bureaucracy, right, it's not something that some evil person came up with to torture us citizens, right? Bureaucracy is a management method that evolved a long, long time ago when people wanted to build scalable systems, right? They came up with the idea of how can I separate my customers from my processing units. My processing units are the office workers. Nobody should know what they're doing. All I'm using is forms to interact with them. I can scale things very easily, right? If I want to make my processing faster, I just hire more office workers. And the process is highly isolated for those using it, right? All I have in interacting with those services is forms. I submit forms, I get forms results. I can compose services by going to multiple agencies, right? I go to agency 1, I submit a form, I get a form, I submit that to the next agency, and that's how I go about doing my business, right? And it may not be a pleasant process for you as somebody doing it because it often is something that doesn't really work so well for you for a couple of reasons. But what I would like to submit as an idea is that if you think about sort of a perfect bureaucracy, right, where the workers are lightning fast and the forms are beautifully designed and everything just works perfectly and you have the impression that, yes, this is really working well for me, right? I think this is really what microservices are trying to give you, right? This idea of everything is isolated from every other processing unit. Those things scale seamlessly. I don't really have to worry about that. Whenever I'm submitting my requests, I get my results, and I go about my way, and maybe I do that in the next place. And I can even have these orchestration things, right? Basically, what happens, and you see that in bureaucracies happening, right? Where you have those services evolving that tell you, we manage this process for you. You just give us a little meta form, and then we go through these 5 agencies for you, and we give you the result, right? So they compose those services for me, and they can do that by understanding how they need to interact with those 5 things, and then they provide to me maybe a more convenient interface for me personally to do that, right? So really, when you think about what happens there is that you can say bureaucracy can serve as a model for service landscapes. And it can be something where you say, that is a way how I can actually conceptualize the things that I'm doing. And mostly what I'm trying to do with that is really trying to explain to you how service architecture works in a way that hopefully sticks in your minds because it's so counterintuitive. But I think there really is such a nice parallel between how bureaucracy in an ideal world works and what it can do for us and what we want service landscapes to look like. Right? Everything is composable, isolated, and everything works just message-driven. Because when you look at it, what microservices tell us is pretty much the only thing that matters in a microservices architecture are APIs. Right? There's nothing else. Everything else is an implementation concern. Right? The only thing that matters for me when I work in a microservices environment, I do my job. If I have to interact with somebody else, I do it through their API. That's the only thing I will ever see. Anything else is strictly forbidden. Right? So the only thing that I really have to work on when I am working as a service designer is to figure out what do my service users need to interact with me, and then encapsulate that through, and that's something that we usually tell people through some kind of message-driven models where you have this form idea basically telling you what do I need as a request, what do I have as a response, and often there's these multi-stage processes. But in the end, it's really sort of this interaction flow through my service. Right? And when you look at it like this, right, where you say this is a shared concept across all of the services that you might have, then this becomes something where you say, hey, now maybe this is something where I can, even though all the services are doing different things and can be implemented in different ways, maybe that's the level where I can really harmonize those descriptions and manage them and make them accessible and provide the visibility so that people can find what's going on, what kind of patterns have people been using. If a service, for example, needs some form of authentication, identification, how are they doing it? Right? And you can find out about those things, and hopefully then with added visibility into your API landscape, you also add more coherence, because over time, that's my theory, right? The more you tell people how things are usually done within your company, the more they will be willing to do it the same way, because most people don't really like to reinvent the wheel when you show them a perfectly working wheel, right? And that also hopefully would reduce the risk a little bit about those designs that are just created out of the blue of people who just design things because they don't know what's around already, right? So what you really should do is work on your landscape as an idea of sort of a harmonized model that is always based on messaging. So messaging is the one unifying aspect that I think is really something that is a shared characteristic of all the services. So those messages, they might come in different flavors. Often when we do our thing, we look at things such as media types or schemas. Sometimes people have different abstractions for that, but in the end, it's just the question of what are the kinds of messages that you submit to services and that services will respond to you. So in the end, those messages are sort of your forms, right, when you look back at the bureaucracy imagery. And the one thing that I think is always hard to do, because it's maybe almost counterintuitive, right? When you design those forms, and that's a quality of well-designed forms, is that they contain as little information as possible, right? Only make your messaging as rich as it has to be to get the job done, because then what happens is you reduce the coupling to some implementation details that actually you don't want to surface, right? One typical example is that in a lot of implementations that you see nowadays, right, you will have people telling you, when you create something, this is where you can find the result, right? And sometimes maybe it's a URI they give you, or a URI pattern, or these kind of things. And what what we usually try to encourage people to do is to say, instead of that, just do it in a way that you just say, well, when you submit something, as a result, we will tell you where it is, right? We don't hard code that. We'll link to that result once we're done doing it. And that, for example, already decouples you a little bit in terms of the ability to change that later on, right? And you find that sometimes when you're using web services that have been around for a while, right, you see that somebody hard-coded that at some time, some implementation changed at a later point in time, and suddenly when you do something over here and you expect the results showing up in a certain place, they don't really show up there anymore because somebody's changed that, right? So somebody had some coupling in there that they shouldn't have had. So trying to be as superficial as possible, and again, maybe as a theme, by superficial, I also mean that in a good way. Try to be as minimalistic, maybe I should say minimalistic, that may be a more positive word, right? That you only put into those forms, into those messages, the information that you really need to get the job done and nothing more, right? Anything that you put in there that doesn't have to be in there is a risk down the line that couples you to some of the details that you probably do not want to hard code into your service surface. And what you really want to do is, and that's the kind of a little bit deeper design discussion that we sometimes have, and I really won't go into any details now because I'm a little short on time. It's basically more guiding people through your process instead of telling them ahead of time where they have to go, right? And once again, you see that, for example, also in good bureaucracy, right? Where instead of always telling people these are the steps that you have to do, instead when you do step one, once you're done with step one, the people producing the result for step one will tell you, and now you have to go over there. And if the system reconfigures, they just start telling you, oh no, now you have to go over there, right? So you can actually, by providing guidance in a flexible way at runtime, you allow the system to reconfigure in ways that don't break users of the system, right? And the design pattern we usually tell people may be useful here is hypermedia, right? Linking things at runtime, and that is something that can be very helpful to allow things to reconfigure on the fly instead of having to hard code those workflows and make them brittle because they might change over time. Now, if you have those ideas of I am designing all those things in similar ways in the sense that I have those message models and I might have certain similarities on how they're used. I may use HTTP, I may use certain headers, for example, that expose information about what media types am I using. I might define my own media types. Now, how you make all those things discoverable, I think that's the interesting part, and that's where we're doing some work in the API Academy, basically trying to come up with an idea of how you allow this documentation of services not just to be something that people have to do, but also to identify certain shared concepts across a variety of documentation instances and say, in our company, for example, when we do authentication, we always do it this way. Or we have those 3 ways, and most services do it this way right now because, I don't know, historically that's how we did it. But the trend is showing we're now doing it increasingly that way, right? So the more you would actually make those concepts of how you use certain technologies discoverable, the more you also make them accessible to tooling. Right? And that's one of the big microservices underlying themes is build things in a way that they are ready for automation and tooling. Right? And I think applying that idea to documentation as well is a big step towards a more manageable service landscape than you typically, I think, get right now when you look at microservices. And once again, this is just making the point that making the descriptions as minimal as possible is a good thing. And defining your own ideas of what you're using is something that can be very helpful. So as a starting point, there's something we have been playing around with, which is nothing more than a very big collection of technical artifacts. So it's an idea of saying, well, if you do services on a technical level, there are all kinds of technical things that you might use, right? You might use HTTP header fields, you might use HTTP status codes, there's a whole bunch of stuff. It's basically just a collection of concepts that make up the web as it is today. As one part of having a better managed service landscape, what we're playing around with is the idea of not just listing those concepts, because right now, frankly, this page that we've created, it's called Web Concepts, you can find it on the web, is a little bit boring because it basically just lists all the header fields and all that stuff that exists, right? So you can just go here and look, what are all the status codes that HTTP has? That's kind of boring. What's not so boring, and that's not what we have right now, sadly, but would be the idea to say, well, I can also look at which of my services are actually using this, right? So when you would look at what media types exist, and you would see your own media types in here, your own information models that your services use, but you would also see, well, 5 of my services are using this media type, and 25 of my services are using this media type, right? That would give you kind of a dashboard of an understanding of how your service landscape looks like and how it is evolving. And that's this whole idea of really better understanding of what's going on, increasing the visibility, and doing that in a way that you can build tooling around it, you can build automation around it, and you give people a better insight into what's happening in your service landscape. And the way you can do it, there's different ways how you can do it, and I will just hint to one of the ideas that we're also playing around with, is basically saying, well, if you have this idea of microservices starting with this as the anti-picture, right, the dreaded monolith that we want to replace, and then our microservices are supposed to look like this, right? They're all very neatly aligned, strictly separate tools. We can use them for individual jobs. But what actually happens in practice, and you see that more and more, and I think the question we heard about combining microservices actually can be a little hard, because it's not like this, right? This is, I have to say that because I'm German, right? This is a German toolbox. So it is very organized, right? I can combine tools very easily. If I need this part, I can combine it with this part, and everything works great, because also the things are built to combine easily, right? Actually, when you look at what microservices are doing, mostly you end up with this, right? A much more messy tool landscape, still useful, much more organic, but also harder to combine, right? Harder to understand what's going on. And what you can do when you have that kind of thing, and not so much this idealized picture, right, is really that instead of using old school discovery, have a decentralized description in place for your services. So saying that whenever you have those services here, right, so these would be your microservices, each of those already needs to have his own little leaflet attached to it. Here's my documentation, right? Here's how I function, here's how you can use me. Here is what I need to have as input and output. Allowing each microservices to do that, to have their own little leaflet, but also building tooling around collecting all of this. Basically crawling your microservices, collecting the information, and then providing the insight that I was talking about in terms of what are my microservices doing? What are the media types that I'm using? What are the authentication methods that I'm using? What are the encryption methods that I'm using, right? Giving you that insight into what's going on while still being true to this microservices idea of giving developers the freedom to pick the tools that they want to use. And also what that could drive, right, is kind of an audit process where you would tell people, well, before you get to deploy this into our production environment, you need to tell me what exactly you're doing, and we might actually need to have a conversation, because you might be doing some things that we think maybe could be done differently, right? So, but you could build also this kind of tooling into the whole thing and say, well, if you're a microservice team, you have to submit your documentation. You can actually run automated checks on it. and you can see is this team using things that we usually are using, or are they building their own snowflake, and maybe we would like to talk to them before this service actually becomes part of our productive landscape. Okay, and that's pretty much all that I have. So just to wrap it up, the point that I wanted to make is really telling you that while the microservices story that we have right now, I think does have some gaps in how it talks about service description and service discovery and some harmonization across services, some ability to have a more coherent service landscape. I think there are ways how we can mitigate that a little bit. And what I think we will see over the next years, and actually in about 2 minutes, right, are some approaches where people are thinking about how can we do that, right? How can we stay true to the microservices approach, but still try to get to a point where we have a little bit more coherence in our microservices landscape. We have some shared design practices, shared design ideas, so that the microservices become a little bit more manageable from an IT landscape point of view. Okay, that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much.